asked to open this and talk about this idea of disconnection, I thought back to when I was young and when I lived in a disconnected world, but actually felt quite connected. That we didn't have the internet, we didn't have smartphones. Some of you will remember this in the room as well. And but we had tight friends in our neighbourhoods and tight friends at school, and I didn't feel disconnected. And I remembered also a conversation with a dissertation student back in 2020. This was in the middle of lockdown, obviously, and they said that I was the first real person they'd spoken to in 3 weeks. And they'd chosen to stay in their accommodation, but that idea of being connected, obviously, you know, how that disconnected world I grew up in would have existed in a pandemic, I don't know, but it struck me as a kind of a very interesting contradiction in many ways that I thought was interesting to start off with. So we talk a lot about connections and a lot of research on how people are connected. There's some work from Waltham Forest and working within tower blocks and looking at how much people are connected within those blocks and how they're connected to others. And what it emphasizes is the power of connection and the importance of feeling connected, and the idea that, you know, people who are better connected are more likely to be hired, get jobs, to be housed, to be healthy, to be happy. Whether those people who are more connected are also more likely to be in the demographic to enjoy that is a question that the research doesn't answer. But it's something that is definitely important in life, having connections, human connections with one another. Now, in my own work in politics, we often see things like this, which is disconnection. This is Ladar Adamic's quite famous work on American politics and how Republicans and Democrats don't exist in the same spaces. They have their own bubbles, they have their own spaces, own sources of news, and there is no connection across those groups. But this isn't just a feature of this kind of institutional politics. There's some research on Mumsnet, and since the pandemic and the increased nervousness about vaccinations that occurred during that period, there is a hostility that has grown on that platform between people and real heat in sentiment and emotion when people talk about vaccinations with those people who are choosing to vaccinate their children being almost, you know, talked about as if they're abusing their children, whereas those who are nervous of vaccinations being accused of putting others at risk. So this sort of hostility then causes a problem across the platform that's meant to be purely about giving advice and mothers sharing their advice to, you know, their other mothers, etc. So these sorts of divisions disconnect people. And there's a whole range of ways in which people become disconnected. And we don't exist in echo chambers. We often see a lot of material that contradicts what we believe. The problem is whether we listen to it, understand the alternative perspectives, consider the validity of different arguments, or whether we just assume that it's wrong. And often we assume that it's wrong. We choose confirmation bias over listening to other ideas. And that, again, is something that can be separating people in the real world, disconnecting people from other groups simply because we hold different views. And not always political views, but different views on a whole range of different things. And often you can find people who love football more likely to talk to fans of other football teams you can over some of these more sort of profound social ideas. But the problems aren't just within that, and this sort of disconnection is also a feature of lives, that we use technology as a way of making connections, but at the same time we disconnect ourselves from the real world, from the people around us. I often find there's nothing sadder than seeing a group of people sat in a pub, which is somewhere I go, and all using their mobile phones and never talking to one another. I always think that's a rather sad sign. But there's a lot of research, particularly from Ofcom, which looks at how young people are almost addicted to their devices and just feel safer and happier using the device for whatever purposes, often just scrolling through content, feeling they have a form of connection with producers of content, but they don't actually have the connections with people in the real world. And sometimes that can also cause a problem because of the content people see. So a lot of people feel, particularly younger people, they find content that upsets them. And one of the comments behind this research, one of the things that people say about this research is that what they worry about is that there are people out there in the real world that say things that would upset them. And so they're nervous about those people in the real world. And so they're happy to stick with their very close friends, but strangers may be those people who upset them. So that's a disconnection that starts with content in the online world, but then filters into nervousness about making real life connections and real life contacts even. A lot of evidence about work in schools with young people, and obviously a lot of young people affected during the pandemic, that sort of isolating period. Lots of groups were formed in that period that exist, but also a lot of concerns about the content that flows around those groups and how much is inappropriate, how much bullying goes on within those groups, and having grandchildren, I know that does exist and does happen. And so can be a problem within those groups, but also how that affects connections in the real world. And I'm part of a project that's not particularly big politically related, but looks at post-industrial communities and talking with some of the young people in those communities. One comment was about having friends that I've got a few close friends, and the guy spends most of his time on Fortnite and other games. And so he has all these people he talks to, but doesn't know them. And a comment from a young man who was talking about the groups of kids that hang around on a place called Westcott in Rotherham, which if you've never been to Rotherham, and I don't expect you would have done, you wouldn't know, but it's a typical square. And you get kids wearing hoodies hanging around, and he made this comment of, I think they've got more friends than I have. I think they're a tighter group than my friends. And that's reflecting the weak ties that often we have online, but the lack of strong ties we sometimes develop in the real world. And so there is a mixture of data, both from my own research and from other sources, about how people are nervous about the real world. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes more due to more moral panics and concerns about what happens. Sometimes it's a place where people can be who they are and say exactly, this is me, this is how I want to be, which they may not feel comfortable with in the real world, which is a positive thing and enables them to make connections. But there's also nervousness about talking to strangers and what might strangers say. And sometimes it feels that people who perhaps would feel discriminated in previous eras, there are spaces there in the real world they can connect, but not spaces which are generally available, or not spaces where many people can feel they connect. It has to have a certain identity around it to feel safe. So those are the forms of disconnection that we face. And so I'm setting the scene perhaps with some of these thoughts. One thing is we can't reduce screen time. It causes fights in families. Yes, you can have curfews. Yes, you can do these things. But actually, there's a lot of research showing that screen time can be a good thing, but also it's very, very hard to limit screen time and reduce that time. But what we also need is real time, real connections with people, time where we can connect with others, make those connections, but do so in a place that we are safe and feel comfortable in doing so. Most community centres have closed. In fact, community centres tend to be much more grounded for older people. So the generation of people who are used to making connections outside of the online environment, have actually more spaces they can go to make connections. Young people particularly feel that there is insufficient spaces where they can find connections. And this will have probably been exacerbated during the pandemic, during 2 years almost of isolation in this country at least, where young people weren't able to make those connections perhaps at a formative point. So find those real world connections is something that I think is important. And there is a lot of research around that issue of not skills but confidence, of feeling confident in public spaces. So I hope that some of these themes, well, I know some of these themes will be picked up on. I hope some of these are thought-provoking for the day and give a sense of how we can think about connections, but also think about how to overcome the disconnections that we face. And thank you.